It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Pierre Sorel, Head of Business and International Taxes Unit within the Tax Policy and Statistics Division at the OECD, who will lead this session. Pierce, the floor is yours.
Super. Okay. Well, thanks to you all for having me at this event and for giving me the opportunity to discuss this with you and to listen to your feedback. I will speak about a new work stream that the Inclusive Framework is undertaking in the area of tax inequality and growth, and then I will try and solicit your feedback as to what your priorities are in terms of what this work stream could cover. So this work stream stems from the G20 Brazilian presidency. The outcome statement as part of that presidency called on the IF to work in the area of tax inequality and growth. And at its most recent meeting in Cape Town, the Inclusive Framework agreed to take forward this work stream on tax inequality and growth, as well as another work stream, as new areas of work in addition to its work on BEPS. So the jurisdictions agreed to do this, focusing on a phased evidence-based approach, which I'll talk about in a moment, trying to think about how jurisdictions can be supported in terms of exercising their taxing powers in the area of inequality and growth, with a focus on domestic tax policy analysis, mutual learning, sharing of good practices, as well as the identification of possible areas of future cooperation. So this is a little bit like what we have already done in the BEPS space, trying to think about how we can learn from one another, whether there are key areas where the OECD can facilitate jurisdictions sharing good practices, etc., and potentially, like in the international corporate tax area, whether there are areas for international cooperation where countries can come together and work more closely together to further their policy priorities in the areas of inequality and growth, noting, of course, that countries' policy priorities are diverse and vary. And I think that's part of this discussion today, to try and understand from you what you feel that your priorities are in this area. So as I said, the Inclusive Framework agreed to take this forward on a phased basis. And I think there is a sense that it's very important to take this work forward gradually, to make sure that we are gathering feedback from our delegates, from members, to make sure that we're going at a pace that members can manage, and to make sure that we're carrying out work in areas that are really the priorities of members. So with that in mind, the IF agreed to a 18-month-long scoping and diagnostic phase, which would involve members sharing their experiences, their challenges in the areas of addressing equality while making sure that growth is supported, and to trying to understand what the key issues are. And to try to make sure that there is enough evidence to take forward work in areas where countries feel that work should be taken forward. In subsequent phases, then, we think that jurisdictions could collectively decide where they want to focus on, what do they think are the key challenges and topics in these areas, and then could contemplate whether they want to take this work forward in terms of sharing best practices with one another, sharing experiences, mutual learning, further analytical work, but also potentially areas where they might consider cooperating multinationally to address inequality while ensuring that growth is supported. But that latter work, that potential further work, best practices sharing, multilateral work, comes later. What we're doing at the moment over these 18 months is to try to undertake a diagnostic exercise to try and listen to countries in terms of what their challenges are, to try and gather evidence in terms of the size of those challenges, so that we can provide the IF with a basis that it can take forward or not next steps in this area. So based on an initial round of discussions with Inclusive Framework members at the Inclusive Framework itself in Cape Town, at some working parties, and also based on bilateral consultations, we have focused on 4 areas that we think are important subtopics included in this overall very broad area. The first is to try to examine the evidence base. One of the issues that has come up, especially in the area of inequality and top taxpayers, high net worth individuals, is that the evidence base is sometimes lacking. Sometimes we don't know essentially, how much tax is being paid, what are the challenges, what are the loopholes, what are the cross-border loopholes, especially when it comes to kind of complex structures that might be used by top taxpayers, what their effective tax burden is, all of these kinds of issues. We also, I think, have a limited evidence base in the growth area, when we try and think about additional taxation of at the upper ends of the income and wealth distribution. We need to understand better the growth implications of doing so. So there's a need for stronger evidence. Building on that, then, we would look to consult further with jurisdictions on challenges they're facing in the effective taxation of capital income. So, of course, the IF has done a lot of work on corporate income, but I think in this area, we're more focused on capital income at the personal level. So taxes like capital gains, dividend taxes, interest taxes, inheritance taxes, wealth taxes, these kinds of issues. So what are the particular challenges that jurisdictions are facing? And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Then in the area of dynamism and entrepreneurship, so the feedback we've gotten from countries is oftentimes when they look at providing concessionary tax treatment to certain kinds of taxpayers, they do so with a view to trying to support growth, to trying to support dynamism, entrepreneurship, new businesses, these kinds of issues. So this raises the question of, well, how can we best support dynamic and entrepreneurship in the economy, while at the same time making sure that we're meeting inequality goals? And then finally, many countries raised with us the issue that while for many developed countries, the tax base is already quite large. There's high tax capacity. A key challenge in reducing inequality, especially in developing countries, is the entire issue of domestic resource mobilization. So in the absence of the ability to spend on education, healthcare, social protection, it's difficult for countries to take action to support equal societies. So those are the areas where we feel that the evidence gathering should focus on. Of course, these are areas where there's a lot of work happening already. There's existing OECD work, analytical work, there's all of the work on information exchange. There's a lot of work that we're doing, also that partners are doing in the area of domestic resource mobilization. So I think there's a lot there to build on. So what we're trying to do as part of this evidence gathering is to understand from countries what their priorities are, to try to gather evidence on those priorities so we can get a sense of the magnitude of different problems, so that we can allow the inclusive framework to decide what it wants to focus on. Are there areas where multilateral cooperation, deeper integration might be beneficial, or is it more a question where mutual learning and evidence sharing could be the best way forward? So with that, I'll briefly drill down into the topic on effective taxation of capital income before opening it up for your questions and views. So why do countries, I think, want to think about the effective taxation of capital? So there's efficiency considerations. Countries know that they need investment and growth, and if taxation of capital is a key area in that. There's obviously big investment needs across the world for various reasons, climate, all of growth, inclusive growth, etc. So that's a key challenge. But also, I think there's a big focus for members on the potential equity implications of taxing capital. So different kinds of income can be taxed in different ways. Commonly, labor tax income is higher taxed, and capital income is taxed at reduced rates. And this raises the issue about whether this can limit the amount of progressivity that countries have in their tax systems, especially countries that rely on the personal income tax to deliver progressivity. So if capital is taxed at lower rates and top taxpayers earn more capital income, then essentially you can risk having a regressive system because you're not implementing effective taxation at the top for those with a lot of capital income. So this is work that we've done some work in this area already, but I think there is a sense from countries that they don't fully have their arms around this problem, and that they don't fully understand essentially what taxpayers are paying, and what they can do in terms of closing loopholes or continuing to address challenges. So as I said, there are a variety of issues that we try to look at that might be purely domestic, that the IF might want to look at further. These can include various kinds of tax arbitrage that might exist inside of a country, purely without engaging in any cross-border activity, shifting the nature of income between different income forms, capital gains or dividends, property income, depending on what's taxed on a concessionary basis. How can countries try to address these issues? How can they strengthen their tax bases? So as part of the evidence gathering, we will look to get additional evidence from countries in terms of the challenges they're facing in this area. But then in addition to the domestic issues, there may be also cross-border issues. We note the big success in terms of the expansion of the tax transparency architecture, but we're aware as well, and you may have seen that we published a stock take of the transparency work that said that there may be continuing gaps and limitations in the transparency architecture that might benefit from continued work, whether top taxpayers can limit their exposure to the tax transparency architecture by obscuring beneficial ownership. Are there challenges in terms of jurisdictions accessing this data or effectively using the data that they do receive under the tax transparency architecture to make sure that they're effectively taxing the capital income that is theirs to tax? Next, jurisdictions raised with us this issue of the increasing mobility of taxpayers, again, especially at the top of the income distribution. The taxpayers may be able to move their tax residency or avoid tax residency with a view to limiting their tax liabilities. So this is an issue where delegates have suggested additional evidence gathering might be beneficial, because one of the issues that delegates have raised with us is, well, we're concerned that if we try and raise the taxes on certain income groups, we worry about out-migration, that top taxpayers may leave or may change their tax residency. And so what can we do about that? And then finally, just the issue that there may be other kinds of challenges more broadly in terms of effectively taxing capital income. For example, when individuals change tax residency, but the underlying source of their income or wealth does not change. Whether there's sufficient administrative capacity within jurisdictions to deal with the more complex schemes that can be used by taxpayers at the top. And so this is another area where we propose to gather feedback, gather insights, and also where possible, gather quantitative evidence that we can use to allow jurisdictions to try and decide what their priorities are, what they want to take forward, and how. So that's really all for me. It was a very brief overview. I think it's important to say at this stage that we've gotten a lot of interest in this area. Countries are getting facing these priorities domestically. They can have political economy challenges where they feel that they may want to support effective taxation of capital, to use the tax system to address inequality, but at the same time, they're facing growth pressures. They need to manage these trade-offs. But at the same time, in the meetings we've had so far, the issues that have been raised are very diverse. And many jurisdictions, I think, want different things. We're conscious of the need to make sure that this work is proceeding in a way that recognizes the priorities of the developing country members of the inclusive framework, so that we're taking forward a project that is really responsive to the needs and priorities of everyone in the inclusive framework. And so with that in mind, we really hope that we can use this time that has been set aside to carry out this diagnostic phase to make sure that we're listening well, gathering the right evidence, so that the subsequent phases of the project that the inclusive framework does take forward are what countries want and are meeting the needs and priorities of all of the members. So with that in mind, I think this event comes at a very good time for us. Just to reflag again, those are the 4 areas that we propose to focus the evidence gathering on. So I think we're very interested in your feedback on the challenges that you're facing, for example, in the area of effective taxation of capital income, and also the challenges that you're facing regarding DRM or any of the other issues that I just mentioned. And then also we're very interested in your views in terms of how can the work of the inclusive framework best support you? What kinds of forward-looking work do you think might be most beneficial?